There comes a moment in every life when the mirror stops lying. It's not the crow's feet or the graying hair, not the slower gait or the heavier breath. It's something subtler, something that whispers rather than shouts. You look at yourself and feel less present, less awake, as if you're slowly becoming background noise in your own story. Aging does not arrive like a thief in the night. It comes politely, patiently, in tiny, invisible exchanges. You trade your speed for caution, your fire for warmth, your dreams for memories, and most dangerously of all, you begin trading awareness for routine. You start forgetting things, not just names or appointments. You forget rituals. Rituals that once made you feel human, alive, sacred, clean, yes, clean. There is a hidden enemy no one warns you about. It's not cancer. It's not dementia. It's something so ordinary, so silent, it slips through the cracks of importance. It's neglect, not the neglect of others, but the quiet neglect of the self, of the temple you live in, of the skin you inhabit. You see, we talk endlessly about exercise, about diets, about medications and miracle pills. But rarely do we speak of the old ritual of cleansing, not the rushed, absent-minded kind, not splashing water on your face or letting the shower do the thinking for you. I mean the kind of washing that is intentional, the kind that honors your body, not because it's perfect, but because it's still here. What if I told you that the key to living longer isn't just what you put in your body, but what you wash away from it? That there are 4 small regions of the body, often ignored, often dismissed, that could determine whether you live to 90 with strength and grace, or leave quietly from a preventable infection, an unnoticed wound, a silent inflammation. These places aren't glamorous. They don't show up in selfies, but they matter, because hygiene in the later stages of life is no longer just about appearances. It becomes about defense, about fighting off the invisible invaders that prey on the slowed, the tired, the distracted. Let me be clear. A single unwashed area can become a breeding ground, not just for odor, but for bacteria, fungus, ulcers, even systemic infection. And you won't know it's happening until it's too late, because time doesn't attack with swords. It seeps in like mold behind the walls, and often it's not age that takes us, it's what age allows us to ignore. And here's the paradox. As we grow older, we accumulate wisdom, but we often lose attention. We begin to conserve energy, not realizing we may be conserving the wrong things. So we forget to reach down and scrub our feet. We skip the awkward bend to clean under the arms. We avoid the groin not out of shame, but out of sheer fatigue. And the belly button, most forget it exists, but the body never forgets. The body remembers neglect. It remembers when something festers, when a microbe multiplies, when inflammation quietly rises until a hospital bed becomes your next mirror. No, this is not fear-mongering. This is reverence. Reverence for the body that has carried you through love, through loss, through decades of both joy and survival. It deserves better than being washed on autopilot. It deserves presence. It deserves knowledge. It deserves a return to the old rituals, not of vanity, but of vitality. Because aging doesn't mean disappearing. It means refining what matters most. So let's start there, with something simple, with something sacred. Let's begin where the body meets the earth, where time leaves its first traces, where neglect begins, but also where healing can begin again. Let's start with the feet. Before we learn to speak, before we ever understand the weight of words, we learn to stand. And where do we stand? On the foundation we forget most. Our feet. 2 quiet structures that have carried you across childhood playgrounds, hospital floors, wedding aisles, kitchen tiles at midnight, and maybe now down the slow hallways of age. Your feet, the most loyal part of your body, the most abused, ignored, and rarely cleansed with intention. Most people think of feet as humble, even unattractive. But in medicine, especially geriatric care, we call them something else. Early warning systems, hidden gateways, sometimes time bombs. Because when you stop paying attention to your feet, time doesn't just march forward. It creeps under your skin, You see, after age 60, the skin on your feet becomes thinner, circulation weakens, and sensation dulls. That means you're less likely to feel a blister, a cut, a fungus, or the beginnings of diabetic neuropathy. You won't smell the early signs of infection. You won't see the slow discoloration under a toenail, but your body will react anyway. One untreated spot can escalate into cellulitis, into sepsis, into hospitalization, into a silent departure no one saw coming. And here's the bitter irony. Most of these cases start with poor foot hygiene, not because the person was careless, but because bending down got harder, because eyesight got worse, because showers became rushed, because dignity started to fade in the face of fatigue. There is a story I carry with me. A 72-year-old man named Mr. Everett lived alone, sharp mind, still wrote poetry. But he hadn't properly washed or checked his feet in months. When his daughter found him, his left foot was swollen, red, and beginning to ulcerate. He thought it was just arthritis. It was an infection that had spread to his bloodstream. He never walked again, all because of a neglected heel. But this chapter isn't about fear. It's about restoration. It's about respecting the foundation that holds you up still after all these years. So here's the truth most won't tell you. Washing your feet is not just hygiene. It's medicine, it's surveillance, it's self-respect. It means using warm water, not too hot. It means using mild soap, not aggressive scrubs that break the skin. It means lifting each foot with care, inspecting it like you would a newborn skin. It means drying between every toe, especially for those with diabetes or poor circulation. Moisturize the heels, but never between the toes. Fungus loves moisture, and you deserve better than to host it. And perhaps the most overlooked step of all, look underneath. Yes, physically, but also symbolically. Ask yourself, what have my feet been telling me that I've been too busy, too tired, or too numb to hear? Is there swelling? Is there a toenail turning color? Is there a patch that feels warmer than the rest? These are whispers of survival, signals that could buy you years if you're willing to listen. Pause, music softens into a more hopeful tone, strings returning. In many Eastern traditions, washing the feet is a sacred act, a sign of reverence, a spiritual cleanse, not just physical. And maybe in the second half of life, that's what it becomes again. Not just something you do in the shower, but a daily ritual of rebirth, a practice of coming home to the body, of saying, I still choose to stand, I still choose to rise, I still choose to walk forward with care. Because longevity is not built in hospitals, it's built in the bathroom, on quiet mornings, by the people who choose to touch what the world forgets. So tomorrow, when the water runs warm and the towel waits quietly nearby, don't just wash your face, honor your foundation. Your future might depend on it. Next, we explore a part of the body that rarely meets the light, but often bears the weight of moisture, heat, and hidden inflammation. Let's go deeper, to a place most avoid but shouldn't. Some parts of the body whisper, others stay completely silent until it's too late. In the stillness of aging, it's not always the bones or the joints that betray you first. Sometimes it's the places you've forgotten to notice. The soft folds, the hidden creases, where sweat quietly gathers, where inflammation quietly brews, and among them few are more overlooked than the armpits. Yes, your armpits. The place most only think about when buying deodorant. A space seen as trivial, even embarrassing. But in the landscape of your aging body, this humble hollow tells a story few ever listen to. Because sweat changes with age. It's not just moisture, it becomes a chemical signature, a reflection of hormones, of stress, of diet, and of the silent war your immune system is fighting. As we grow older, the body's ability to regulate temperature shifts. We sweat less overall, but what remains can accumulate in dangerous ways. The skin under your arms becomes thinner, more fragile. The sweat glands become clogged, infected, inflamed. And the worst part, you don't feel it. Because the nerves grow dull. Because the mind is focused elsewhere. because nobody ever taught you that unwashed armpits could become the birthplace of inflammation. And here lies the danger. When sweat is left to sit, especially in dark, warm spaces, it becomes a breeding ground. Bacteria, yeast, even precancerous irritation can take root here, especially if the immune system is already working overtime with age-related issues. Rashes, abscesses, lymph node swelling, infections that begin as a harmless itch, and end in systemic inflammation that taxes the heart, the kidneys, the lungs. I remember a patient, Maria, 68, strong-willed, proud, never missed a church service, but she'd long stopped washing under her arms thoroughly. She said it felt undignified to need help with such a personal area. When she finally came in, she had a painful red lump beneath her left arm. She thought it was from her bra. It was an abscess compressing her lymph node, dangerously close to her bloodstream. One forgotten detail, one neglected ritual, 1 week in the ICU. But this is not about blame, it's about awareness. Because your armpits do more than hold scent. They protect the gates to your lymphatic system, your body's garbage collectors, soldiers, and peacekeepers. When this area is clean, the lymph nodes below can function freely. They flush toxins. They regulate immune response. They reduce chronic, low-grade inflammation, a condition now linked to almost every major disease of aging, from arthritis to Alzheimer's. So what does care look like? It looks like warm water and mild, pH-balanced soap. It looks like gentle fingertips, not aggressive scrubbing. It looks like drying the area fully, especially under each fold. And sometimes, it looks like choosing fragrance-free over fresh breeze sprays that clog more than they help. But above all, it looks like respect. Respect for this misunderstood space that works silently, every hour, every day, to cleanse your inner world from what the outer world gives you. And here's the most beautiful part. Washing your armpits isn't just about cleanliness. It's about reclaiming power in the most vulnerable places. It's a private moment between you and your survival. Because the small daily rituals, the places no one sees, the parts we overlook, those are often where disease finds its opening, and equally, where healing begins. So tomorrow morning, when the mirror greets you with wrinkles and wisdom, when the water runs and the towel waits, don't skip the hidden hollows. Don't rush past the silence, because life whispers here, and it's asking you to listen. And just as the armpits guard the body's inner defense system, there's another area, just as soft, just as often ignored. That carries the weight of identity, memory, and subtle signs of aging. Next, we rise upward, toward the sacred space of the neck. There are parts of the body we don't speak of, parts we cover, parts we pretend. Don't need care once youth has faded, but silence is dangerous, because what we do not face, we cannot protect. And there is no region more sacred, more private, more powerful than the groin, the crossroads of life and legacy, where strength once lived and now, where fragility often hides, where intimacy once bloomed, and now where discomfort quietly builds. It is here, in this hidden battlefield, that countless elderly men and women fight a war they never name. The battle to stay clean, to stay healthy, and to keep their dignity. Let's speak plainly. As we age, caring for the groin becomes harder. The skin folds deepen. The sweat glands become more active or, ironically, dry and inflamed. Mobility decreases. Arthritis stiffens the spine. And reaching down there, it becomes a daily struggle that no one talks about. Even the most independent elder, who still drives to the grocery store and keeps their house spotless, may quietly skip cleaning that most vulnerable area. Not from laziness, but from shame, from pain, from the sheer difficulty of access. And the consequences, they are rarely visible, but they are deeply real. Infections, yeast, urinary tract complications, painful itching, sores, even ulcers, odor that embarrasses, skin breakdown that leads to fungal overgrowth, and worst of all, loss of confidence. The groin is not just a body part, it is the seat of our selfhood. When it hurts, we don't feel like ourselves. When it's neglected, we lose more than health. We lose a little bit of identity. I remember an old veteran, Mr. Harris, age 82. He had survived war, burying a wife, raising 4 kids. But in his final years, what undid him was a rash in his groin that became a recurring fungal infection. He was too proud to ask for help. By the time he came to the clinic, the skin was broken and bleeding. "I survived the battlefield," he whispered. "But this is my last fight." And he was right, because the fight for hygiene is also the fight for dignity. So let's talk about care, about how to protect this most intimate space. Warm water daily, never too hot. Use unscented, gentle cleansers, not harsh soaps that strip the skin. Carefully clean between the folds without scrubbing too hard. Pat dry, never rub, especially if the skin is thin or moist. For men, gently lift and clean under the scrotum. For women, avoid douching or fragrant sprays. Focus on the outer folds only. And always change out of damp undergarments immediately. Sweat becomes poison when trapped. But more than all this, we must clean with compassion, not just for the body, but for the history it carries. Because this groin, this hidden battlefield, once cradled creation, it carried children, it bore pleasure, it held the heat of young love and the ache of aging loss. To wash it is not shameful, it is holy. And if your hands no longer reach, do not be afraid to ask for help. From a spouse, from a caregiver, from someone who sees your worth, not just your wrinkles. Because there is no shame in being cared for. The only shame is when we pretend we don't need it. This body of yours has fought long and hard. It deserves more than a quick rinse. It deserves reverence, even in the folds, even in the silence, even in the places no one else sees. So tomorrow, as you step into the shower, bend gently, move slowly, but don't skip the battlefield, because in cleansing what is hidden, you reclaim your strength, and your dignity is worth fighting for. And now, we rise from the folds of the private to the lines that everyone can see, to a space that reflects age more clearly than any wrinkle. Next, we move to the elegant frontier, the neck, the mirror of health, time, and silent warnings. It sits quietly at the center of the body, nestled in the soft curve of the abdomen, tucked away like a forgotten memory, the belly button, so small, so unassuming, yet it holds the echo of your first connection to life, the scar of dependence, the mark of origin. Before you had a name, before you drew your first breath, you were tethered to another through this tiny hollow. It is where you were fed, where you were sustained, where life entered you before you even knew what life was. And now, most barely touch it, others never clean it. Some don't even remember it exists. But in the quiet center of the belly lies a forgotten truth. Neglecting the navel is not harmless, it's hazardous. Bacteria thrive in shadows. And the belly button with its folds, oils, and warmth is a perfect breeding ground. Sweat, dead skin, lint, soap residue all settle there, layer upon layer unseen. Many seniors, with reduced vision and mobility, skip this spot entirely. Who cares, they say, it's just the belly button. But that tiny hollow, it can harbor over 2,000 strains of bacteria. And left unchecked, it can lead to foul odor, yeast infections, cyst formation, skin irritation, even deep-seated abscesses. I've seen patients, dignified, clean on the surface, with inflamed navels that oozed infection. They were stunned. How could something so small become so dangerous? It's because we've bought into a myth that what we cannot see cannot harm us. That cleanliness is about what shines on the outside, that as long as we bathe, we are safe. But real cleanliness isn't cosmetic. It's about honoring every corner of the body, even the ones that don't beg for attention. So, how do you care for this forgotten hollow? Once a day during your bath, dip a clean cotton swab into warm water or gentle soap. Gently swirl it inside the navel, never forcefully. Rinse and dry completely. Moisture invites mold. If you have a deep innie, be even more attentive. Once a week, dab with a mild antiseptic if prone to buildup. And if mobility is a challenge, there's no shame in asking a caregiver for help. Your health is worth more than modesty. Because here's the truth. The navel is not just a place. It's a symbol, a reminder that even in old age, we are still connected. To our birth, to our story, to our need for care. The belly button whispers, remember where you came from. Don't forget your roots. Don't forget yourself. When you wash it, you're not just removing dirt, you're reclaiming attention. To the parts of you that time tried to erase, you're saying, I still matter, every inch of me still matters. In a world that asks the elderly to shrink, to be less visible, to disappear quietly, even washing your belly button becomes a radical act of self-respect. And perhaps that's the greatest form of wisdom, to care deeply for even the smallest places. And now that we've journeyed inward, into the soft hollows and hidden truths, it's time we raise our eyes toward the part of the body that always meets the world first. The part that reflects every emotion, every sleepless night, every year lived. The face, not just to clean but to honor. There's a truth in medicine that few admit out loud. Aging doesn't weaken us simply because of years. It weakens us because of what we stop doing, what we stop noticing, what we let go quietly until it lets go of us. Doctors see this pattern every day, but they rarely say it this plainly. Hygiene in old age isn't just about feeling fresh. It's about preventing the cascade that ends in dependence. You see, cleanliness isn't cosmetic, it's chemical. It's neurological, it's biological. When a senior neglects hygiene, especially specific body parts, here's what quietly unfolds beneath the surface. Studies show that personal hygiene is tied directly to cognitive engagement. When someone stops washing regularly, especially intricate areas, the brain begins to detach from routine, from touch, from memory. Neglecting hygiene can even be an early warning sign of dementia. Not because they forget to bathe, but because they forget why it matters. Routine cleansing activates sensory input, neural pathways, and self-awareness. It's not just the body that gets dirty. The mind can become fogged by neglect too. We often speak of bacteria as the enemy, but your skin, your groin, your feet, even your belly button are home to millions of friendly microbes that keep you healthy. But when hygiene falters, the ecosystem turns toxic. Overgrowth of bad bacteria leads to chronic inflammation, fungal infections, UTIs, wound infections, bed sores, cellulitis, in rare cases, sepsis. Doctors may treat the infection, but they know the real culprit is almost always this: invisible, silent hygiene erosion. Your skin is the largest organ in your body, and in old age it becomes thinner, drier, more fragile, but it is still your first shield. Regular cleansing with lukewarm water, gentle pH balance cleansers, and careful drying doesn't just keep it clean. It maintains the acid mantle, a thin protective film that fights off pathogens. Most over 70s bathe less often, use harsh soaps, or neglect moisturizing. The result: micro tears, rashes, cracking skin, and open invitations to bacteria. It's not about bathing more, it's about bathing smarter. Doctors won't always say it in the room, but behind closed doors they notice the patient who smells faintly sour, the skin that is subtly flaking, the unwashed feet that tremble under weight, the belly button inflamed beneath the gown. It's not judgment, it's heartbreak, because they know what follows: isolation, embarrassment, refusal to accept help, and slowly the shrinking of life itself. Hygiene isn't about being clean. It's about staying visible to yourself, to others, to life. Doctors see time differently. They don't count it in years. They count it in function, in independence, in how long you'll be able to live life without depending on others for basic care. And hygiene, yes, just hygiene, is the first domino. They don't always say it, but now you know. When you stop washing certain parts, you're not just neglecting the body, you're surrendering control, bit by bit, day by day. But here's the other side. Because the body is forgiving and the human will is strong, you can reclaim that power by starting small, by washing your feet, by caring for your groin, by remembering your navel. by honoring your face. And when you do, you're not just cleansing the body. You're sending a signal to your brain, to your heart, to the world. I am still here. I still care. I still fight for my dignity. Hygiene is no longer a task. It is a ritual of resistance. And so, with this truth finally spoken aloud, we prepare to close this journey. One more step remains. A reflection, a reckoning, and a quiet revolution that begins every morning. With water, with touch, and with self-respect. Let's walk together now, into the final chapter. There comes a time in life when you begin to understand something. A clean body is more than hygiene. It is a language, a declaration, a quiet whisper to the world and to yourself. I am still here, I still matter. You see, the elderly are often taught to accept decline, to act their age, to shrink, to retreat, to vanish gently. But that is not the nature of aging. The nature of aging is transformation. And transformation begins with awareness. You don't need luxury to grow old with grace. You don't need wealth or youth serums or plastic promises. You need clarity. You need ritual. You need to honor the details. When you take a warm cloth and touch your own skin. When you lean forward to wash your feet. When you clean the creases of your groin with care. When you dab gently inside your belly button. When you wipe behind your ears, your eyelids, your elbows. You're not just cleaning. You are returning to yourself. You are saying, I will not let time erase me. I will not let age reduce me. I will not let silence take away my sacred right to feel alive. Doctors may call it hygiene. Science may call it prevention, but the truth is, caring for your body is a spiritual act. It is a meditation, a moment of gratitude to the vessel that has carried you for decades. It is not about being presentable to others. It is about being present with yourself. Every wrinkle, every scar, every tired muscle. They tell a story, but they also ask for care, not out of shame, but out of reverence. So let this be the lesson, the reminder, the quiet rebellion. Don't skip the little things. Don't rush the water. Don't stop reaching for your toes. Don't stop feeling your skin. Don't stop believing that your body deserves attention, because it does, even in old age. Especially in old age. The smallest act of care becomes the greatest act of power. And when your body is clean, your mind clears. And when your mind clears, peace arrives. Not the kind that comes from giving up, but the kind that comes from finally choosing yourself. And now, my friend, you know, the parts no one talks about. The wisdom doctors don't always speak. The rituals your grandparents might have whispered, but you forgot. Let this not be the end, but the beginning of how you treat your body, of how you treat your soul, of how you rise each day, to wash, to breathe, to be seen, and to live fully. If this message touched something in you, if it reminded you of your worth or someone you love, please leave a comment below. Share your story, your experience, your wisdom. Subscribe to the channel for more deep, soulful content about aging, health, and the quiet truths no one tells you. And share this video with someone who might need to hear that even in old age, they are still whole, still beautiful, and still powerful. This is elderly wisdom and health, where growing old isn't a curse. It's a sacred art.